The door flew open before Evelyn Carter could reach it. 3 men stepped onto her porch like they owned every board beneath their boots because they intended to. The papers in Gerald Hale's hand were still damp from the ink. She recognized the sheriff's seal. She recognized the signatures. What she did not recognize was the world she was standing in, because 48 hours ago her husband was alive, and now his brother was holding a document that said this house, this land, everything Thomas Carter had built with bleeding hands belonged to someone else. If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe to this channel and drop your city in the comments below. Let's see how far Evelyn's story travels. Now let's go back to that porch. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. Evelyn had not slept. Not the night Thomas died, not the night after, not the morning the neighbors stopped coming by. Grief had a way of replacing sleep with a kind of hollow wakefulness. Eyes open, body still, mind replaying the same 30 seconds over and over. Thomas at the breakfast table. Thomas laughing at something she said. Thomas pressing his hand flat against his chest, his face going white, and then the sound his chair made when it hit the floor. She had been in the middle of washing dishes. She still thought about that sometimes, the way she'd kept holding the rag even after she ran to him, the way her hands wouldn't stop moving even when everything else in the world went still. Gerald Hale had shown up at the funeral. He stood at the back of the small gathering with his hat in his hands, and a look on his face that Evelyn had read as grief at the time. She'd thanked him for coming. She'd shaken his hand. She'd said, "Thomas always spoke well of you," which was not entirely true, but felt like the right thing to say over a grave. That was 4 days ago. Now Gerald stood on her porch with 2 men she'd never seen, and a document she couldn't stop staring at, and the expression on his face was nothing like grief. "I know the timing is hard," he said. He didn't sound like he thought the timing was hard. "But these things don't wait on feelings, Evelyn. The law is the law." She looked at the papers again. Her name wasn't on them. Thomas's name was on them, but crossed through, not corrected, crossed through, like a mistake someone had decided to fix. The signature at the bottom belonged to Sheriff Dale Pruitt, whose office she had walked past 100 times without ever once needing to go inside. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Thomas signed it," Gerald said. "Before he passed. A debt arrangement. The property transfers upon his death. Thomas didn't have debts. Thomas had debts he didn't tell you about." Gerald said it with a small smile, the kind that sat just below pity. That was his way, wasn't it? Protecting you from things. Evelyn looked at the 2 men behind him. One of them was watching the tree line. The other was watching her. "I want to see Sheriff Pruitt," she said. "He's the one who sent us," Gerald said. "His seal is right there. I want to see him in person." Gerald folded the papers with the patience of a man who had already decided how this conversation ended. "You have until sundown. That's generous, Evelyn. More than generous. You take what belongs to you personally, clothes whatever Thomas gave you as gifts, and you go stay with someone. You've got the Whitmore woman, don't you? Down the road. I'm not leaving my home." The word landed in the air between them and didn't move. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her into the house like he was already measuring the rooms. "You don't have a home," he said quietly. "Not anymore." She closed the door in his face. She stood with her back against it, listening to the boards creak under his weight as he shifted, as he said something low to the men with him, as one of them laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, just the easy laugh of someone who has never had to fight for anything. Then she started moving. She didn't think. Thinking was slow, and she didn't have time for slow. She went to the bedroom first, pulled Thomas's hunting pack from under the bed, and began filling it with the only logic she trusted what would keep her alive. Dried venison from the cellar, 3 wool blankets, her heaviest coat, and both pairs of gloves, the small iron tinderbox Thomas kept on the mantel, his rifle, the one he'd taught her to shoot, and every cartridge she could find in the drawer beside the hearth. She paused at the drawer. There was a folded piece of paper at the back of it behind the cartridges behind a broken compass Thomas had never gotten around to fixing. She unfolded it. It was a map hand-drawn his handwriting lines that she recognized as the hill country northeast of their property. He'd drawn it years ago when he'd taken her to the cave for the first time. If you're ever in a bad spot, he had told her then, standing at the mouth of it with his lantern throwing gold light against the stone, this is where you come. Stone holds heat. Spring runs underground. Nothing finds you here that you don't lead there yourself. She had laughed. She remembered that. She had said something like, "What kind of bad spot are we planning for?" And he had smiled the way he smiled when he was being serious, without wanting to seem serious, and he said, "The kind you don't see coming." She folded the map and put it inside her coat flat against her chest. She took one more pass through the house quickly, not looking at anything too long, because she didn't have the right kind of time for that. She took a small hatchet from the woodpile by the back door. She took the sharpening stone from Thomas's workbench. She took the coil of rope hung by the barn door and the skinning knife from the hook above it. She did not take photographs. She did not take the blue dress she'd worn on her wedding day. She did not stand in the kitchen and grieve the curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks, or the window Thomas had replaced twice because he couldn't get the seal right. She walked out the back door before Gerald's men could come around the side. She was into the trees before the sun touched the tops of the hills. The cold came down hard the moment the tree cover closed over her. This was the thing people who'd never spent real time in northern wilderness, didn't understand the forest, didn't protect you from cold, it just changed the shape of it. The wind dropped away, and the silence rose up instead, and in that silence, the cold was patient. It had nowhere else to be. Evelyn moved fast. She knew these hills not as well as Thomas had known them, but well enough. They had walked this land together 100 times hunting season early spring, when the ice broke on the creek the summer she'd twisted her ankle in a rabbit hole, and he'd half carried her the last mile home, making her laugh the whole way despite the pain. She pushed that thought down, not away down. There wasn't room for it yet. The pack was heavy. She'd overpacked maybe, but the alternative was underpacking, and she knew which mistake killed people faster. She adjusted the straps and kept moving, watching the angle of the light through the trees using Thomas's map only once, when she wasn't sure which branch of the trail bent north. It took 3 hours. The cave entrance was smaller than she remembered, or maybe she was older than the last time she'd stood here, which amounted to the same thing. A narrow split in the rock face easy to miss if you didn't know to look tucked behind a deadfall that had been there for as long as she could remember. She squeezed through. Inside, it opened up. That was the thing about it. You had to commit to entering before you could see what you were entering. Maybe 10 feet wide, maybe 14 deep, with a natural shelf of rock along the far wall that caught the cold less than the floor. The ceiling rose in the middle, to a height she could stand straight in. There was a crack above running diagonal the air shaft Thomas had shown her, the one that would allow smoke to escape if she built a fire low and managed it carefully. She set the pack down and stood still for a moment. The rock was cold. The silence was total. There was no sound anywhere, not wind, not water, not animals. Just the sound of her own breathing and the faint settling of the mountain around her. "All right," she said aloud. There was no one to say it to. She said it anyway. She built a fire first because everything else depended on warmth. Thomas had taught her that. Cold hands make bad decisions, he used to say. She found dry wood under the deadfall outside, not much, but enough to start, and she coaxed a flame from the tinderbox with the steadiness of someone who had done it before in better circumstances and was not going to fail at it now. The smoke rose, found the crack in the ceiling, and pulled through. She watched it carefully. It moved. Good. She worked until the light inside the cave shifted from firelight bright to firelight dim, which meant evening was coming on outside. She'd cut armloads of pine boughs for the floor insulation, cushioning something between her body and the stone when she slept. She'd organized her supplies along the rock shelf food in the center, where it would stay driest tools hung on natural jags in the rock. the rifle leaning against the wall where she could reach it without moving far. She ate a small portion of the dried venison. She drank from the canteen she'd refilled at the creek on the way up. She did not allow herself to sit down until the work was done, because she knew herself well enough to know that once she sat down, the weight of the last 4 days would find her, and she needed to be finished working before that happened. She sat down. It found her. The sound that came out of her surprised her with its smallness. She had expected something larger, some heaving release of the grief she'd been pressing down since the moment Thomas's chair hit the kitchen floor. What came instead was barely a sound at all, more like the air going out of something. She pressed her hand over her mouth and let it happen quietly, which was the only way she knew how to do things she didn't want to do. She thought about Gerald's face on the porch, that small smile. Thomas had debts he didn't tell you about. She thought about Thomas's actual face, the real one, not the pinched and pain-struck expression of his final moments, but the one she'd known for 11 years. Stubborn mouth. Eyes that creased when he was trying not to laugh. The way he smelled like cedar and iron in the winter. She thought about the map he'd drawn by firelight and tucked into a drawer behind a broken compass against a day he hoped would never come. "If you're ever in a bad spot," he had said. She pressed her palm against the stone floor of the cave. Cold. Real. Still here. "I'm in a bad spot," she told him. The fire crackled. The mountain held its silence around her. She dried her face with the back of her wrist, pulled the blanket tighter, and made herself think practically. Which was hard. Which was maybe the hardest thing she had done in 4 days, and 4 days had been full of hard things. But practical thinking was the only thing between her and freezing, between her and starving, between her and whatever Gerald Hale had in mind for a widow who'd refused to go quietly to someone else's house and disappear. She had enough food for a week, maybe 10 days if she was careful. She had the rifle and 11 cartridges. She had a knife and a hatchet and rope. She had fire and the means to keep it. What she needed was more of everything. More wood immediately. Traps for small game, she'd need to build those from materials she'd find in the forest, which she knew how to do, but hadn't done in years. She needed to find the underground spring Thomas had mentioned test, if it was still running, because the canteen was a temporary solution at best. She needed to identify what plants were still accessible under the early snow roots bark. Anything she could supplement the venison with. She needed to do all of it before the real snow came. She looked at the entrance of the cave, the narrow split of rock, the faint gray of evening light beyond it. Winter was coming. She could feel it in the particular way the cold had settled in the last 2 hours, a deepening, a thickening, the air itself becoming something heavier. She had seen enough northern winters to know what that particular feeling meant. She had 2 weeks, maybe 3. Then the blizzard season would arrive, and everything would be different. She added a log to the fire. Small log carefully placed. She was already learning the economy of this cave, the way heat moved in it, where it gathered, and where it leaked. She thought about Gerald standing in her kitchen in 2 days or 3, walking through every room with that easy ownership, touching Thomas's things, deciding what to keep. The anger that moved through her then was clean. Not hot-cold, actually. The same temperature as the cave floor, under her hands. Clear. Useful. She was not going to disappear. She was not going to be the widow who froze in the hills and got found in the spring tragic and forgotten. A story Gerald Hale told at the tavern to justify what he'd done. She was going to survive this winter. She was going to come back down from this mountain. And when she did, she was going to walk through the door of the life that had been stolen from her, and she was going to take it back, every board, every acre, every piece of paper with Thomas's name on it. She had never wanted anything so fiercely in her life. She lay down on the pine boughs, pulled both blankets over herself, and listened to the mountain. Outside somewhere in the high dark, the first real wind of winter was beginning to move. She could hear it not inside the cave, but beyond it, pushing through the treetops with a low, uneven sound, something between a moan and a whisper. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would start building. She was up before the light. Not because she had slept well, she hadn't slept at all, not in any real sense. She had drifted in and out of something that felt less like rest, and more like her body shutting down one room at a time to conserve heat, then slowly reopening them when the cold pressed too close. But the moment the darkness outside the cave mouth shifted from black to the particular deep gray that meant morning was thinking about arriving, she was already moving. The fire had burned low. She fed it carefully 2 small logs, positioned to catch without smothering, and while it climbed back, she pulled on her second layer, stamped feeling back into her feet, and made herself eat before she did anything else. Half a strip of venison. A handful of the dried nuts she'd had the presence of mind to grab from the pantry shelf. She chewed slowly and thought about the day in front of her, the way Thomas had taught her to think about a long hunt, break it into pieces. Work the pieces, don't look at the whole thing at once, or it'll paralyze you before you start. She needed wood. That was first. Not kindling, she had enough kindling from the deadfall outside. She needed serious fuel, the kind that would burn for hours, the kind that would hold heat through a long night when the temperature dropped below what a single blanket could fight off. That meant finding standing dead timber and bringing it down, and bringing it down meant using the hatchet, and using the hatchet meant hours of work that would drain her in ways she couldn't afford if she didn't pace herself correctly. She took the hatchet and went out into the morning. The cold hit her like something solid. She'd expected it, she'd felt it through the cave walls all night. But expecting cold and meeting it face to face were different things. She stood at the cave entrance for 3 full seconds and made herself breathe it in, slow and even, letting her lungs adjust. That was another thing Thomas had taught her. Don't fight the cold. The cold doesn't notice. You're the only one getting tired. She found standing dead timber 40 yards up the slope, 3 birches that had died in place dry enough that the wood split with a clean sound when she tested it with the hatchet blade. She worked for 2 hours. Her hands went from cold to burning to numb, and then past numb into something she stopped thinking about, because thinking about it didn't help, and the wood still needed cutting. She hauled load after load back to the cave, stacking it inside against the left wall, away from the fire, away from the moisture that would collect near the entrance close enough to reach without fumbling in the dark. By the time she finished, the stack was shoulder high, and she was breathing like she'd run a mile. She stood back and looked at it. It wasn't enough. It was a week's worth, maybe less, if the cold deepened the way she suspected it would. She would need to do this again, and again. She would need to do it until her arms stopped working, or the snow made it impossible, whichever came first. More tomorrow, she told herself. That's enough for today. It wasn't enough for today. She still needed traps. Tig. Thomas had taught her 3 kinds: a simple snare for rabbits, a deadfall for anything heavier, and a trigger trap that required more materials than she currently had, but produced better results. She started with the snares. She had rope, she could cut it into lengths, tie the loops, find the runs where small animals moved between their feeding grounds and their cover. She'd watched Thomas do it dozens of times. She had done it herself twice with him guiding her hands. Alone, it took longer than she expected. Not because she'd forgotten she hadn't the knowledge was in her hands as much as in her head, but because her fingers were stiff, and the light was already angling low by the time she got to it, and she was working with the particular deliberate slowness of someone who knows that a mistake now means hunger for days. She set 5 snares in the first hour. She was unhappy with 2 of them and reset them. She moved further along the hillside, reading the snow, not deep yet, just a skin of white over the frozen ground, looking for the small compressions and scrapings that meant animal traffic. She found a run along a fallen log, another near a cluster of wild rosehip bushes that had shed most of their fruit, but still carried enough of a scent to pull in hungry things. She set her 7th snare and stood up, and her back screamed at her. She pressed her fist against the base of her spine and breathed through it. 48 hours ago, she had been in her own kitchen. She tried not to think about that. On the walk back to the cave, she found the spring. She almost missed it. It was tucked under a shelf of rock, barely moving, the kind of trickle that would vanish entirely in a hard freeze, but hadn't yet. She knelt and put her hand in it. Cold enough to ache, but running. Clean, or as clean as she could judge without testing. She'd need to boil it at least until she was sure, but it was there. It was there. She sat back on her heels and laughed, a short, surprised sound, not quite joy, but something adjacent to it. The first thing that had felt like luck in almost a week. "Thank you," she said to Thomas, to the mountain, to no one in particular. She refilled the canteen and went home. She checked the snares at dawn the next day. Empty. And the day after that. Empty. On the third morning, she found a rabbit in the second snare she'd set, the one she'd been least happy with, which struck her as the kind of joke the wilderness liked to make. It was a good size. She cleaned it quickly and efficiently, without sentiment, the way Thomas had taught her. "Sentiment is for after you've eaten," he used to say. She didn't fully agree with that, but she understood the practical wisdom of it. She roasted it over the fire that night and ate it slowly, taking her time with the bones, and she thought, "This is what surviving feels like. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like this. One rabbit, one night. Tomorrow is another problem." She was beginning to understand something about herself that she hadn't known before this week, that she was more suited to hardship than comfort, that the waiting and the uncertainty and the small daily grind of keeping herself alive was not destroying her the way it might have destroyed someone else. It was, if anything, focusing her. Every morning she woke up, and the task was simple and total: stay alive. Don't freeze. Don't starve. Don't make a mistake you can't recover from. There was a strange cleanness to it. She did not allow herself to think about Gerald Hale for 3 days. On the 4th day, he came to find her. She heard them before she saw them. 2 horses picking their way up the hill trail. She heard the creak of tack, the huffing breath of animals working hard in the cold. She was outside the cave cutting wood when the sound reached her. She went still. She listened. Then she picked up the rifle, checked the load without making noise, and moved into the trees to the left of the cave entrance, where she had a clean sight line to the trail without being visible from it. Gerald appeared first. He was on his gray horse, wearing a heavy coat she didn't recognize, and behind him was one of the men who had stood on her porch, the one who'd been watching the tree line. They stopped 20 yards from the cave mouth. Gerald looked at the entrance, looked at the woodpile visible inside, looked at the thin thread of smoke rising from the rock face above. "Well," he said to the man behind him, "she's been busy." The man said something she couldn't hear clearly. "It doesn't matter," Gerald said. "She can be busy all she wants." He dismounted. He walked to the cave entrance and looked inside for a long moment, and she watched him from the trees, with her finger resting outside the trigger guard. And she thought about Thomas, and she kept her breathing very slow. Gerald reached into his coat. He pulled out an axe handle, just the handle, no head, and walked to her woodpile. She understood what he was going to do a half-second before he did it, and still she wasn't fast enough to stop it, because stopping it would have meant stepping out of the trees, and she didn't know yet if they were armed. He drove the handle through the side of her woodpile like a lever. Wood cascaded across the cave floor. He found her food shelf, next the dried venison, the nuts, the small reserve of cornmeal she'd managed to get from the storage route she'd dug up 2 days ago, and swept it with one arm. Things scattered. Some things broke. Her tin cup hit the stone floor, and the sound of it rang out sharp and bright in the cold air. Then he took out a piece of paper and a nail and drove the nail through the paper into the cave wall with the heel of his palm. He walked back to his horse, mounted. Looked at the tree line once, not at her, not at the right place, but close enough that she pressed her back against the birch trunk and held herself absolutely still. "She'll come down on her own," she heard him tell the other man. "Give it a week." They rode back down the trail. She waited until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then she waited another 10 minutes, because Gerald Hale did not strike her as a man who relied on one plan. Then she went back into the cave. The woodpile was a mess, but it was salvageable. He'd scattered it, not destroyed it, which told her he'd wanted to send a message more than he'd wanted to actually break her. The food was worse. The cornmeal was gone, spilled into the dirt and lost. 3 strips of venison had fallen into the ash at the edge of the fire pit. She picked them up, examined them, decided they were still edible, and set them aside. She picked up the tin cup. It was dented, but intact. Then she walked to the wall and read the note. A widow alone in the hills is a sad story. A widow who freezes alone in the hills is a tragedy. Come down before you become the second kind. G. H. She read it twice. She took it down from the wall, folded it carefully, and put it in her coat pocket next to Thomas's map. Evidence, she thought. She wasn't sure yet what she would do with it, but she had learned from watching Gerald operate that everything could be useful later if you kept it long enough. She restacked the wood. It took an hour. When she was done, she sat by the fire and let herself be angry. Really angry. Not the cold, controlled kind she'd carried since the porch, but the hot kind, the kind that burned in the chest and made the hands shake. She let it come, and let it move through her, and then she let it go, because anger was a fire, and fire was only useful if you directed it. She directed it toward the traps. That evening, she set 3 more snares and reinforced the 2 deadfalls she'd been less confident about. She found a second spring smaller than the first closer to the cave, nearly frozen, but not quite. She marked it. She cut an additional load of wood and added it to the stack that she now arranged differently, staggered against the wall, so it couldn't be easily toppled by a single blow. She was teaching herself in real time to think like someone who expected to be attacked. Thomas had been a man who planned for what could go wrong. She had always been more of a hoping for the best sort of person, not naive exactly, but inclined toward the belief that reasonable people would behave reasonably. Gerald had corrected that belief very efficiently. She was learning. On the 6th day, the sky changed. It didn't announce itself the way she might have expected. No dramatic buildup, no visible storm front rolling in from the north. It just changed. The color of it, the quality of the light, the particular heaviness that settled into the air like a held breath. She stepped outside to check her nearest snare, and looked up and knew. She went back inside and worked for 7 straight hours. She cut wood until her arms gave out, then rested 20 minutes and cut more. She checked every snare and collected what was in them. 2 rabbits and a grouse, which felt like extraordinary luck, and which she smoked immediately over the fire. Low heat, long time, using the green wood she'd set aside specifically for this purpose, because green wood made better smoking smoke than dry. She gathered every edible thing she could find within a quarter mile of the cave. Dried rosehips, frozen crab apples, the inner bark of young birch, which was bitter but caloric. She packed it all in. She filled every container she had with water from the spring and set them near the fire to keep from freezing. She blocked the lower half of the cave entrance with cut boughs and packed snow, leaving just enough space to squeeze through. Insulation. Thomas had shown her that too, though he'd been talking about a lean-to at the time, not a cave. The principle held. By evening, she had done everything she could think of to do. She sat by the fire and listened. Outside, the wind had begun. Not the light wind she'd heard since the first night. This was something with weight to it. Something that moved through the treetops with a low, continuous roar, that she felt as much as heard a pressure against the rock around her, against the walls, that were also the mountain. The temperature inside the cave dropped 2 degrees in an hour. She felt it on her face, the only skin she'd left uncovered. She added a log to the fire. She thought about Gerald's note. Come down before you become the second kind. She thought about Thomas at the cave entrance with his lantern, the gold lights, his voice steady and serious beneath the humor. If you're ever in a bad spot, this is where you come. I'm still here, she said. The wind answered her, pushing at the walls, looking for a way in. She pulled her knees to her chest and leaned toward the fire and watched the smoke find the crack in the ceiling and rise thin and dark up through the rock and out into a sky she could no longer see. The blizzard hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. She could hear it in the voice of the wind, the sound a storm makes when it's still deciding whether to be bad or catastrophic, still working up to whatever it intends to become. She had survived 6 days. She had food. She had fire. She had walls of stone around her that had been standing since before any hail was born and would be standing long after the last one was gone. She had survived worse. She told herself that, and she was not entirely sure it was true, but she told herself anyway. She closed her eyes and listened to the mountain and waited for morning. The blizzard arrived at 3 in the morning. She knew because the sound changed. For 6 days the wind had been a presence, something moving past her around her, something with direction and intention. When the storm truly hit, the sound stopped having direction. It became everything at once, all sides, the rock itself vibrating with it, the kind of white noise that wasn't peaceful at all, but was instead the sound of the world deciding to erase itself. She woke up with her hand already on the rifle. It took her a moment to understand that there was nothing to shoot. Just the storm. Just the mountain shaking itself awake in the dark. She built the fire up higher than she'd been allowing herself to, and sat close to it, and listened to the blizzard explain what it intended to do. It was not subtle. It drove snow through the bow barrier at the cave entrance in fine horizontal sheets that dusted the floor white within minutes. The temperature dropped so fast she could feel it as a physical pressure, the air thickening against her face, her ears the backs of her hands. She pushed the bow barrier tighter, then tighter again. She packed more snow along the outside of it, reaching through the gap at the top with numb arms, packing and pressing until the draft dropped to almost nothing. Almost. She went back to the fire and stayed there. By morning, if it was morning, she could no longer tell by the light, because there was no light coming through the cave entrance, only white and gray, and the howl of wind. She had already run through every practical task she could think of, and invented several she didn't strictly need. She reorganized the food stores. She resharpened the hatchet blade. She inspected every inch of rope she had, and retired 2 feet of it that showed fraying she didn't trust. What she was doing she knew was keeping her hands busy so her mind wouldn't turn inward. The mind in isolation, in darkness and cold, was not a trustworthy instrument. She'd been alone for 6 days before the storm, and that had been manageable because she could go outside, because the horizon was still there, because the trees and the sky reminded her that the world was large and she was a specific person moving through a specific part of it. Now the world had contracted to the size of the cave, and the cave was getting smaller with every hour. She thought about Gerald Hale and used the anger the way she'd been using it, as fuel, as direction. She thought about the forged document, the sheriff's seal, the 2 men standing on her porch like they were owed something they'd never earned. She thought about Thomas's name, crossed through on paper that someone else had handled, and she felt the anger move through her chest like something with weight to it, and it kept her warm for a while. Then that burned out too, the way all fires did. She ate sparingly, drank water she'd kept from freezing by keeping the containers close to the fire. She told herself stories, not out loud, not yet, but inside her head, the kind of stories she'd made up for herself as a girl when the nights were long. After a few hours, she wasn't sure anymore which parts she was inventing and which parts she was remembering. That was the first sign, though she didn't recognize it as one. On the 2nd day trapped inside, she noticed the smoke. Not the smoke from the fire she'd been watching, that carefully monitoring the way it rose toward the air shaft, making sure the draw was still good. This was different. This was smoke that wasn't going anywhere. She looked up. The crack in the ceiling, the diagonal split that served as her ventilation, was still open. Or it appeared open. She couldn't see up through it far enough to be certain, and the storm outside would have been packing snow into every crevice, every crack, every gap in the rock. She added a small log to the fire and watched the smoke. It rose. It found the crack. It disappeared through it. She told herself it was fine and went back to her position by the wall. 30 minutes later, her eyes were watering. She rubbed them and thought it was tiredness. She hadn't slept well, hadn't slept enough. The cold and the noise and the anxiety of the storm combining into a kind of wakefulness that left her exhausted without actually letting her rest. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held them there for a moment. When she took them away, the room seemed slightly darker than it had been. The fire's burning low, she thought, and reached for another log. An hour after that, her head hurt. A specific kind of hurt. Not the dull ache of tension or cold, not the sharp pain of a wound, but something deeper and more insidious, something that seemed to come from inside the skull and press outward. She stood up, and the world tilted. She sat back down. She looked at the fire. The fire looked wrong. The color of it was too orange, the edges too soft. The smoke. She watched the smoke. The smoke was not rising cleanly anymore. It was drifting, moving sideways before finding the crack. Some of it wasn't finding the crack at all. Understanding arrived slowly, which was itself a symptom of the problem, though she didn't know that yet. The air shaft was partially blocked. Snow, probably. Packed in by the wind, filling the crack from outside, narrowing the draw until the ventilation was no longer adequate. The fire was still burning, but it was burning in air that was becoming insufficient, and the smoke it produced was not all escaping, and the invisible product of that. The thing you couldn't see or smell, only feel too late. "Get up," she said aloud. Her voice sounded far away. She stood. The world tilted worse than before, and she grabbed the cave wall with both hands and held on while the dizziness passed through her in a slow wave. Her fingers found a crack in the rock, and she used it as an anchor. The axe, she thought. Get the axe. She knew where it was. She had put it on the rock shelf to her left, third item from the right. She had organized everything in this cave so that she could find it in the dark. She made herself turn toward the shelf, and she counted items with her fingers. Rope knife sharpening stone. And then the hatchet handle was in her hand, and she held it and breathed, because breathing was the problem, and breathing was also the solution. Because if she stopped thinking clearly, she was going to die in here, and she was not going to die in here. Thomas, she thought, and she didn't mean to think it, but it came anyway. She heard his voice. Not the way she'd been hearing it in the back of her mind since the kitchen floor. That was memory echo, the way a person you loved stayed alive in the specific sound of certain sentences. This was different. This was close. This was the voice from across a room. "Evie." She turned. There was nothing there. The fire, the wall, the shadows moving the way shadows moved when the light was unsteady. "You're tired," his voice said from the shadows from the back of her skull, from somewhere that wasn't a place. "You've done enough. You can rest now." The hatchet in her hand seemed very heavy. She thought, this is what dying feels like, and it is exactly as quiet as people say. She thought Thomas would never tell me to rest now. Thomas would never, that is not Thomas. She swung the hatchet at the ceiling. She missed. The blade hit rock 2 feet to the left of the crack, and the shock of it traveled up her arm, and she bit down on the inside of her cheek, and the pain was bright and useful and real. She repositioned. She looked directly at the crack, made her eyes focus, made her brain do the simple geometry of angle and distance. She swung again. The blade caught the edge of the crack, and ice fell, not snow ice. It had been there long enough to freeze solid, and a chunk of it struck her across the cheek, and she barely felt it. She swung again, and again. The crack widened at the bottom. She could see it widening, could see the difference in the way the light fell from the opening above. Cold air came down like a hand pressed flat against her face. She gasped. She swung the hatchet one more time higher, driving into the ice that had formed at the neck of the shaft, and a mass of it collapsed inward, hit her on the shoulder, knocked her sideways. She caught herself against the wall, and then the draw returned. She could see it happen. The smoke from the fire, which had been drifting listless and confused, straightened itself and rose and found the shaft and moved upward with purpose. The air in the cave shifted. The weight in her chest began to lift by degrees. She slid down the wall to the floor. She sat there for a long time, the hatchet across her knees, the cold air coming down through the shaft and washing over her, and she breathed carefully and deliberately, the way you breathed when you were reminding your body that it was still doing the most basic necessary thing. She was shaking. She looked at the shadows where she'd heard Thomas's voice, and there was nothing there, only the fire and the wall, and she was simultaneously glad of that and utterly, completely hollowed out by it. "Not yet," she said. She said it to the shadows. She said it to whatever had visited her in the dizziness and the dark, whatever shape her mind had built from grief and want, and the particular cruelty of almost. She said it the way you said things to an argument you intended to win. Not yet. She did not sleep that night. She kept the fire low enough to provide heat without overwhelming the ventilation. The balance she should have found earlier. The balance she would not miscalculate again. Every hour she checked the air shaft with a stick, probing upward through the crack, making sure the ice wasn't reforming. Every hour it was clear. Every hour she added that to the narrow column of things she could trust. She thought about the voice. She was not a woman given to mysticism. Thomas had been he had believed in signs, in the meaning of certain dreams, in the sense that the world was not entirely random in its arrangements. She had loved him for it while not entirely sharing it. But sitting on the stone floor of a cave in the third day of a blizzard, she found herself willing to allow that some things didn't need to be explained completely in order to be true. Something had told her to get up. Whatever it was, whatever shape it wore, it had come at the exact moment she needed it, and said exactly the wrong thing. You can rest. You've done enough. And in being wrong, it had made her fight. Maybe that was Thomas. Maybe that was her own mind generating the threat it needed to generate the response. She didn't know. She didn't think it mattered. What mattered was the axe in her hand, and the ice on the floor around her, and the air moving clean and cold through the crack above. On the fourth day of the storm, she found the second note. She hadn't been outside. She hadn't opened the bow barrier except once briefly to check conditions. She'd been met with a wall of wind and white that told her exactly nothing useful, and she'd sealed the entrance again within 30 seconds. So she couldn't explain at first how the folded piece of paper came to be wedged in the lower corner of the bow barrier, half hidden under the packed snow at the base. She found it when she was reinforcing the barrier for the third time, pressing her palms flat against the bows to check for new gaps. Her fingers found the edge of it. She pulled it free. It was damp, the ink slightly smeared but legible. I know about the deed. Real one. Thomas hid it before he died. I think I know where. I can't say more here. I'll come when the storm breaks. Don't shoot me. R.W. She read it 3 times. R.W. She ran the initials through everyone she knew. 3 people. Then she landed on one. Ruth Whitmore. The woman Gerald had mentioned on the porch. You've got the Whitmore woman, haven't you? Down the road. She had known Ruth since she and Thomas moved here 9 years ago. Ruth was 60, sharp-tongued, had buried 2 husbands of her own, kept chickens and a garden, and an opinion about everything. She was not, Evelyn would have said, a woman who went out in blizzards. And yet. Evelyn looked at the cave entrance. Outside, the storm had not broken. She could still hear it, though perhaps slightly less total than yesterday, perhaps the outer edges of it beginning to exhaust themselves. She pressed her palm flat against the bow barrier and felt the wind push back. Ruth Whitmore had come up this hill in this storm to leave a note under a barrier she wouldn't have known to look for unless she'd been watching the cave entrance before the storm hit. Which meant she'd been watching before the storm hit. which meant she had been watching possibly since the beginning. Evelyn folded the note and put it in her coat beside the first one and Thomas's map. The pocket was getting full. She sat back by the fire and let herself think about what the note meant, not just the information in it, but the existence of it. Gerald had 2 men and a sheriff and forged documents. She had a widow in a cave and an old woman who walked through blizzards. It didn't sound like much. She thought about it differently. Gerald had everything that looked like power. She had everything that was actually true, and one person who knew where something real was hidden, which was sometimes worth more than all the machinery of corruption, because machinery needed fuel, and lies needed maintenance, and the truth just needed to be found. I know about the deed. Real one. Thomas. Of course, Thomas. He'd known what his brother was, maybe, or suspected or prepared against the possibility. He'd drawn a map to a cave and tucked it behind a broken compass. He had been, quietly, all their years together, the kind of man who prepared for what he hoped would never come. She pressed her hand against her coat against the pocket where the map lived. "What else did you leave me?" she asked. The fire gave its small, steady answer. The wind outside was slightly quieter than it had been an hour ago. She was almost certain. She listened again. Yes, slightly quieter. The storm broke on the 5th day. Not dramatically. There was no moment of silence, no sudden stillness. It simply became, over the course of several hours, less. The roar dropped to a moan. The moan dropped to a keen. The keen became the ordinary sound of wind moving through trees after snow. At some point in the late afternoon, she realized she could see gray light around the edges of the bow barrier. Real light, outside light. And she sat with that knowledge for a moment, like a cup of something warm. She dismantled the barrier, carefully setting the boughs aside for reuse. The world outside the cave was white and still and absolutely enormous. She stood at the entrance and looked at it for a long time. The trees were buried to their lower branches. The trail she'd walked every day for nearly 2 weeks was entirely gone. The contour of the land, rearranged by drifts, familiar shapes made strange by the weight of snow. The sky above was the pale, washed-out blue of aftermath, and the cold was fierce but clean, the kind of cold that told the truth about itself. She stepped outside. Her legs were unsteady after days of restricted movement. She walked the first 20 yards, slowly testing each step, reading the surface. She found the spring by memory. It was buried, but she dug down through the snow with the tin cup and found it still running underneath, slower, nearly freezing, but alive. She straightened up and looked down the hill. She couldn't see Gerald's hunting camp from here. She knew it existed. She'd spotted it from a higher position 2 weeks ago. Smoke from a fire horses in a rough corral. The kind of temporary setup a man used when he intended to wait something out without going to the trouble of actually being uncomfortable. He had been patient. She would give him that. He had believed the winter would do his work for him. She wondered if the blizzard had been as total down there as it had been up here. She wondered if his patience had held through 5 days of it. She wondered if his camp was still there. She would find out. Not today. Today she needed to get her body moving again. Assess what the storm had taken and what it had left. Check every snare inventory, every calorie. Today was practical. Today was recovery. But tomorrow she would go further. She went back inside and started working. By the time the light failed completely, she had checked all 8 snares. 3 had been destroyed by the storm, and would need resetting 2 held animals she cleaned and hung. She had cleared the cave entrance of accumulated ice. She had restocked the wood she'd burned during the blizzard, and she had eaten the first real meal she'd allowed herself in days. She lay down on the pine boughs and pulled both blankets over herself. Her body ached from the top of her skull to the soles of her feet. Her shoulder, where the falling ice had caught her, had purpled into a bruise she'd been ignoring. Her hands were a collection of small wounds in various stages of healing. She was alive. She was warm. She had food. Outside, somewhere down the hill, Ruth Whitmore was waiting for the storm to break. Outside, somewhere further down, Gerald Hale was existing in a world where he still believed she was going to come down on her own beaten and broken and accept whatever terms he offered. She closed her eyes. She slept for 8 hours without waking, the first real sleep since before the storm, deep and total, and without dreams she could remember. When she opened her eyes, the fire had burned to coals, and the cave was cold and gray with early light, and she felt for the first time in 2 weeks something that might have been ready. Not healed, not whole. Something harder than that and more useful. Ready. Ruth Whitmore arrived at noon. Evelyn heard her before she saw her, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots through deep snow, the sound of someone who had stopped caring about being quiet a long time ago and moved through the world at the pace the world deserved. She was at the cave entrance with the rifle before she caught herself, and then she stood it against the wall and waited. Ruth appeared through the trees with a wool scarf pulled up to her nose and both hands visible, which Evelyn noticed and appreciated. "You look terrible," Ruth said by way of greeting. "You walked through a blizzard," Evelyn said. "Before the blizzard. I came the morning it started." Ruth stopped at the entrance and looked at the cave interior with the frank assessment of a woman who had seen genuine hardship and wasn't impressed by theater. "I couldn't get back down after. Spent it in the Prentice Trapper's hut half a mile east. You know the one? Thomas used it for elk season. Good hut. Bad firewood." Ruth unwound the scarf from her face. She looked older than Evelyn remembered. Or maybe it was the cold, the particular way extreme weather aged a person from the outside in. Her eyes, though, were exactly as sharp as they had always been. "I left you the note." "I know. I found it. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure you were still in there." She paused. "I'm glad you were." Evelyn moved aside to let her in. Ruth stepped into the cave and looked at the woodpile, the food shelf, the arrangement of tools, the fire-taking inventory, the way a practical woman did when she walked into someone else's survival and wanted to understand what she was dealing with. "Thomas taught you well," she said finally. Evelyn's throat tightened. She pressed past it. "You said in the note you knew about the real deed." "I do." "Then tell me." Ruth sat down on the rock shelf slowly, the way cold joints moved, and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at Evelyn with an expression that contained something Evelyn hadn't seen directed at her in 2 weeks. Not pity, not concern, something more like respect, which was harder to receive than either of those. "Thomas came to see me," Ruth said. 3 days before he died. He didn't know he was going to die, nobody knew that. But he came anyway, which I've thought about a lot since." She paused. "He said Gerald had been making noise, asking questions about the property line, about whether Thomas had any debts outstanding, about what happened to a widow's claim if there was no will properly filed. He said he didn't trust it." Evelyn was very still. "He asked me to hold something for him, said he'd come back and explain it properly when he had more information." Ruth reached into her coat. Her hand came out with a folded document sealed with a strip of wax that had been broken and repressed the way something looked when it had been opened once and resealed. "He didn't come back." She held it out. Evelyn took it. Her hands didn't shake. She was almost surprised by that. She opened the document carefully, unfolding each crease slowly, and read. It was the property deed. The real one. She could see immediately that it was different from the one Gerald had shown on the porch. The paper was older, the filing stamp from the county land office dated 8 years ago, the year she and Thomas had bought the land. Her name was on it. Both names. Thomas Allen Carter and Evelyn May Carter, joint tenancy with right of survivorship. 7 words that meant the property could never pass to anyone else upon Thomas's death. 7 words that made every document Gerald had produced legally worthless. She read those 7 words 4 times. "He knew," she said. "He suspected," Ruth said. "He didn't know Gerald would move this fast. I don't think he expected—" She stopped, started again. "I don't think he expected to not be here to handle it." Evelyn folded the deed and held it flat in both hands. She thought about Thomas, 3 days before his death, walking down the road to Ruth Whitmore's house, with this document under his arm, making arrangements against a possibility he hadn't wanted to speak aloud. Planning for the worst the way he always planned, quietly, without drama, without burdening her with the weight of the maybe. She wanted to be angry at him for that. She tried. She couldn't. It was too much like him. It was exactly him. "There's more," Ruth said. Evelyn looked up. Gerald didn't just forge documents. He had help. Not just the sheriff, someone in the county land office. "There's a man named Ellison who handles deed filings. He's been in Gerald's pocket for 2 years from what I've been able to piece together." Ruth said it the way she said everything, directly, without cushioning, as if she thought cushioning was a form of dishonesty. "Gerald's done this before, not with family land. There's a family 3 towns north. The Abercrombies lost their farm 2 winters ago to a debt claim that nobody could find the original paperwork for. A widow there too." The word sat between them. "He does this to widows," Evelyn said. "To anyone alone," Ruth said. "But widows are easier, less likely to fight, more likely to be believed helpless." She looked at Evelyn. "He miscalculated with you." Evelyn set the deed carefully inside her coat, next to Thomas's map, next to Gerald's 2 notes. The pocket was genuinely full now. She thought about that, the way a person's survival could be measured in paper, in the things you held on to when someone tried to take everything. "I need to go down the hill," she said. Ruth nodded. "I know. Not to town, not yet." She looked at the cave entrance. The light outside was flat and white, the post-storm light that made distances hard to judge. "Gerald's camp. I want to see what the blizzard did to it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "That's not curiosity," she said. "What is it?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. Which was mostly true. She left the rifle in the cave. Ruth had argued about that, briefly, with the efficiency of someone who didn't believe in arguing past the point where it was useful. Evelyn's reasoning was simple. She didn't know what she would find at the camp, and walking into an unknown situation with a rifle changed the nature of every possible outcome in ways she wasn't prepared to navigate. She took the hatchet. She took the knife. She left the rifle. They moved down the hill together, Ruth slightly ahead, because she knew where the trail ran. Even under 4 feet of snow, she'd walked these hills for 40 years, and the land was in her feet, the way language was in the tongue. Evelyn followed her tracks and thought about what she'd do if the camp was intact. If Gerald was there. If the 2 men were there. If the sheriff had come up. She had a legal document, and an old woman, and a hatchet. She had the truth, which she was learning was a less reliable weapon than people suggested, until the exact moment it became the only one that worked. They smelled the camp before they reached it. Not smoke, the opposite of smoke, the particular cold absence that meant a fire had been out for a long time. And beneath that, something else, something she couldn't immediately name, and then could. Ruth stopped walking. "Stay here," Evelyn said. "I will not," Ruth said. They went forward together. The avalanche had come down the eastern face of the ridge. She could trace it from the debris field, the line where the snow had sheared off, and gathered itself into something with mass and momentum, and no particular opinion about what it encountered. The camp had been at the bottom of that line. The corral was visible only as a series of post tops protruding from the snow at irregular angles. The supply tent was flat, buried the fabric of it, visible in one corner, where the snow had not quite covered everything. A single horse impossibly stood 30 yards away at the edge of the trees, alive, unhurt, still wearing its tack, looking at them with the baffled calm of an animal that had survived something it didn't understand. The main tent, the sleeping structure the largest, had partially collapsed and then been buried. Evelyn walked toward it. She found the first man, one of the 2 from the porch, by his boot, which was protruding from the snow at an angle that told her what she needed to know before she dug any further. She did not dig further. She marked the location and moved. She found Gerald at the back of the collapsed tent, in the section that had held longest before the snow weight brought it down. He was on his side, one arm extended, and the cold had done what the cold did quickly, at these temperatures preserved him in the position of the last moment, a stillness that was total and permanent, and had nothing theatrical about it at all. His face was turned away from her. She was glad of that, and then felt strange about being glad, and then decided that was a feeling she could examine later when there was time for it. She looked at the space around him. There was a saddlebag partially visible. The snow around it disturbed in a way that suggested it had been moved or was in the process of being moved when the avalanche hit. She pulled it free. It was heavy. Inside papers, a leather ledger, a tin box with a hasp lock that she opened with the blade of her knife in less than a minute. She went through it all there in the snow, her hands moving fast because the cold was serious and her fingers were already going. Ruth stood beside her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The ledger was Gerald's own hand. She recognized the writing from the note he'd left on her cave wall. It was a record of transactions, dates, names, amounts. She saw Sheriff Pruitt's name 4 times. She saw a name she didn't know, Ellison, which confirmed what Ruth had told her. She saw the Abercrombie name and a date 2 winters past and an amount. She saw Thomas's name, and next to it in Gerald's writing, deed transfer pending. Ellison confirmation, E removed. E removed. She read it twice. The cold pressed at her hands. She read it a 3rd time and understood that this was what it looked like from Gerald's side, a plan, an item on a list, a task with a status. Her removal from her own life, from her home, from everything Thomas had built, written in a ledger like a business arrangement. She closed the ledger. She put it in the saddlebag with the other papers. She put the tin box in the saddlebag. She stood up and slung the bag over her shoulder. Ruth was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We need to go to town," Evelyn said. "Today?" "Yes." "Evelyn." Ruth said her name with a particular weight. "The man is dead. The law. The law is Sheriff Dale Pruitt." Evelyn said, "Whose name appears 4 times in that ledger and who is currently sitting in an office in town, believing that I am frozen somewhere on this mountain." She adjusted the saddlebag strap. "I want to be standing in front of him before anyone tells him otherwise." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "There's a living horse over there." "I know. I'm 60 years old, and my knees are not suitable for walking to town in 4 feet of snow. I know that too." The horse's name, according to the brand on his flank, was one of Gerald's, a large gray animal, well-fed, the kind of horse that cost money. He allowed Evelyn to approach him without shying, which she took as a judgment on the relative worth of the people who'd been handling him recently. She checked his legs, his hooves, his tack. Everything sound. Ruth mounted with the deliberate dignity of a woman who had made peace with her limitations and refused to be embarrassed by them. Evelyn walked. The snow was deep, but she was wearing the right boots, and she had been walking difficult terrain for 2 weeks, and her body had a different relationship with hard ground than it had when she left the house. They came down out of the hills in the late afternoon, the light going amber and long across the snowfields. Evelyn had been thinking the whole way down. Not about what she'd say to the sheriff, that was simple. The ledger would do most of the talking. She was thinking about the order of things, the sequence that mattered. Who needed to hear what first, and from whom, and in what room, with which documents visible on which desk. She was thinking the way Thomas would have thought, she realized. Methodically, planning against contingency, not assuming reasonable people would behave reasonably, but preparing for the shape of their unreasonableness in advance. She was different than she had been. She could feel it in the quality of her thinking, harder, faster, less willing to hope, when certainty was available if she worked for it. The first person who saw her on the edge of town was a farmer named Carl Betts, who stopped his wagon and stared at her with an expression she couldn't interpret until she remembered what she must look like. 2.5 weeks in a cave, whatever weight she'd lost, the weathering, the particular expression of someone who has come down from a mountain carrying something. "Mrs. Carter," he said. We thought. He stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. "Is Pruitt in his office?" "Should be." "Is there anyone else in town with legal authority?" "A circuit judge, a deputy from the county seat, anyone?" Carl blinked. "Judge Harmon is in Millfield. 2 hours by—" "Can you ride to Millfield?" Yes, but I need Judge Harmon in this town by tomorrow morning." She held his gaze. "I have documents that concern property fraud corruption of a county official and the use of a law enforcement officer in a civil theft. I have a ledger with names in it. I have the original deed to my property. I need a Judge Carl. Can you ride?" He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Ruth, who gave him the particular expression Ruth Whitmore gave people when she had already decided what they were going to do and was waiting for them to arrive at the same conclusion. Carl Betts said, "I'll leave in 10 minutes." "Thank you," Evelyn said, and walked past him toward the sheriff's office. The door to the office opened before she reached it. Pruitt stepped out onto the step, and she watched the sequence of expressions move across his face. Surprise, which he covered fast. Then calculation. Then the arranged blankness of a man deciding how to manage a situation that had departed from his expectations. He was a large man. Always had been the kind of large that had once been physical authority and was now mostly gravity. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "We were concerned." "No, you weren't," she said. He looked at the saddlebag. Something shifted in his face. "Why don't you come inside?" he said. "I'd rather do this here," she said. "In the open, where people can hear." She was aware without looking that people were stopping. The street was not busy. It was late cold post-blizzard, but there were people. A woman in front of the dry goods store. 2 men outside the farrier's. Carl Betts, still with his wagon not leaving yet, watching. She pulled Gerald's ledger from the saddlebag. "Gerald Hale is dead," she said. "Avalanche took his camp on the north face 2 days into the storm. I found his body this morning." She watched Pruitt's face when she said this. "I also found this." She held the ledger so he could see it without being able to take it. His face went very still. "I found records of payments," she said. "I found the name Ellison. I found the Abercrombie transfer." She let a pause land. "I found your name, Sheriff, 4 times." The woman in front of the dry goods store had not moved. The 2 men outside the farrier's had moved closer. "Now," Evelyn said, "you can invite me inside and we can have a conversation, and you can explain to me how your name appears 4 times in a dead man's fraudulent ledger, and I can decide whether I believe your explanation before Judge Harmon arrives tomorrow morning. Or you can make this a different kind of situation, and I promise you the ledger survives whatever you decide to try." Ruth on the horse behind her said nothing. She didn't need to. Pruitt looked at the ledger. He looked at Evelyn's face. He looked at the people on the street who were no longer pretending not to watch. He took a step back. "Come in," he said. His voice had changed. The management was gone from it. What was left was smaller. Evelyn walked up the step and through the door. She kept the ledger under her arm and the saddlebag on her shoulder, and she did not look back because she didn't need to. She knew what was behind her. She had carried it down the mountain herself. Pruitt's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper, and the particular staleness of a room where someone had been spending too much time indoors, convincing himself that everything was under control. Evelyn set the saddlebag on his desk. She did not sit down. She stood on the other side of the desk from him and watched him lower himself into his chair with the heaviness of a man whose body had already understood what his mind was still resisting. The lamp between them threw yellow light across the ledger's cover. He looked at it the way a person looked at something they wished they could make disappear by not acknowledging it. "Gerald told me it was clean," Pruitt said finally. "He told me the debt arrangement was legitimate, that Thomas had signed it willingly." "Thomas never signed anything willingly that he didn't tell me about," Evelyn said. "In 11 years, not once." "I had no reason to doubt." "You had every reason." She opened the ledger to the page she'd marked with a strip of pine bark on the way down the hill. She turned it to face him and pressed her finger against the entry. "This is a payment. To you. Dated 6 weeks ago, before Thomas died." She moved her finger 2 lines down. "This is another. 3 weeks ago, 4 days after the funeral." She looked up. "You were paid before the fraud was committed and after it was completed. That is not a man who had no reason to doubt. That is a man who chose not to look." Pruitt's jaw worked. He was building something, an argument, a justification, the architecture of a defense he'd probably been constructing in his head since Gerald first approached him with the arrangement. She could see him assembling it behind his eyes. "Gerald is dead," he said. "Yes. Whatever was in that camp, whatever he had, the man is gone. There's no one to corroborate. Ruth Whitmore will corroborate." Evelyn said it quietly. "She'll corroborate Thomas visiting her 3 days before his death. She'll corroborate what he left in her keeping." She pulled the deed from her coat and laid it beside the ledger. "Joint tenancy, right of survivorship. Filed 8 years ago with the county land office. Your seal, the legitimate one from 8 years ago, is at the bottom of it." She paused. "The document Gerald showed me has a seal dated this year. Someone in the land office made it for him. You know who." Pruitt said nothing. "Ellison," she said. The name landed the way she'd known it would not, as a surprise, but as the removal of the last thing he'd been hiding behind. His shoulders dropped a 1/4 inch. Small movement. Total surrender. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice had gone flat. Professional almost in its resignation. The voice of a man shifting from denial to negotiation. "I want my house," she said. "I want my land. I want every document Gerald produced declared fraudulent and withdrawn from the county record by Judge Harmon's hand in writing witnessed. I want Ellison removed from the land office." She held his gaze. "And I want a letter, in your handwriting, explaining what you knew when you knew it and what you were paid." He stared at her. "In exchange for that letter," she said, "I will allow Judge Harmon to determine the appropriate consequence for your involvement, rather than pursuing the matter myself in a manner that involves a federal circuit court and everything that implies for a man in your position." She let him sit with that for 3 seconds. "That is a generous offer, Sheriff. It has a limited duration." Outside through the office wall, she could hear the street voices, the sound of more people gathering, the particular murmur of a small town becoming aware that something was happening at its center. Ruth would be talking. Ruth was very good at talking. Pruitt picked up his pen. He wrote for 40 minutes. Evelyn stood the entire time. She did not pace. She did not look away from him for longer than it took to blink. She watched the pen move across paper and thought about Thomas at Ruth's kitchen table, pressing a deed into an old woman's hands and asking her to hold it. And she thought about Gerald in his camp in the hills, patient as a man who had done this before and expected to do it again. And she thought about all the things that had to go exactly right for her to be standing in this office on this evening, watching the instrument of her dispossession write his own confession. Too many things. The odds of it assembled in her mind, and she looked at them steadily and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not gratitude exactly, though that was part of it. More like the specific vertigo of realizing how narrow the passage had been. 1 degree of difference in any direction, and she was something else. She was the second kind of widow Gerald had described in his mocking note. She was a tragedy someone told at a tavern. She was not that. She was standing here. Pruitt finished the letter, blotted it, and pushed it across the desk. She read every word. It was complete. It was specific. It named Gerald, named Ellison, named the amounts and the dates and the nature of what he'd agreed to do and what he'd agreed to ignore. It was the kind of document that once in a judge's hands became its own momentum. She folded it and put it in her coat. "The deed," she said. "I keep it tonight." "That's—" He stopped, started again. "Yes. Judge Harmon will be here in the morning. You will be in this office when he arrives. You will not leave this town tonight." She picked up the saddlebag with the ledger and the tin box. If you're not here when Harmon arrives, everything I have goes to the Federal Circuit by noon, and the letter becomes the least of your problems." She walked to the door. "Mrs. Carter." She stopped, did not turn. "I am—" He paused. "I'm sorry about Thomas." She stood with her hand on the doorframe for a moment. She thought about whether she believed him and decided it didn't matter, and decided that the not mattering was itself a kind of answer about where she was now and where she had been 3 weeks ago. She opened the door and walked out into the cold. Ruth had gathered without appearing to gather an audience. She was standing outside the office with Carl Betts's wife and 2 of the farmsteaders from the northern plots and the minister from the white church on the hill road, and they were arranged in the loose ellipse of people who had been talking for a while and had more to say. When Evelyn came out, they looked at her, all of them, with an attention that she felt as a physical thing, a weight she hadn't expected. She stood on the step and let them look. "Gerald Hale is dead," she said, not loudly, but clearly. "The avalanche took his camp, his men with him." She let that settle. "The property transfer he filed is fraudulent. I have the original deed. Judge Harmon is coming tomorrow." She paused. "Sheriff Pruitt has provided a written account of his involvement. That account is in my possession." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Carl Betts's wife, a small woman named Harriet, who had always been kind to Evelyn at church and had not come by after Thomas died, which Evelyn had noticed, said, "Where have you been all this time?" "In the hills," Evelyn said. "Alone?" "Yes." Harriet looked at her, really looked, the way people sometimes forgot to do. Then she said, "Come have supper. You look like you haven't eaten properly in weeks." Evelyn wanted to say no. The reflex was there, the independence that had calcified in the cave, the self-sufficiency she'd built from necessity and had started to wear like armor. She felt it rise up, and she recognized it for what it was, which was fear. Not of Harriet's kitchen, fear of needing something from another person. Fear that needing was the first step toward the kind of helplessness she had fought so hard to avoid. She recognized it. She put it down. "Thank you," she said. "I will." She did not sleep at Harriet's house. She sat at the kitchen table until the fire burned low and Harriet went to bed, and the house was quiet, and then she sat alone with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and the deed and the ledger and the letters spread across the table in front of her. She read through everything one more time, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to hold the whole shape of it in her mind at once. To see it as a complete thing, rather than the series of pieces she'd been gathering in the dark. When she was done, she stacked the documents neatly and set her cup beside them. She looked at her hands. They were different than they had been. Not just the roughness, not just the small healing wounds, though those were there. The way they held themselves was different. She had always had working hands, she'd grown up working, had never been the kind of woman who kept soft. But there was something in the way she held them now that she could not find a word for in any language she knew. Like something had been burned out of them that she hadn't known was there. Some hesitation. Some latent apology for taking up space. Gone. She pressed them flat against the table. Solid wood, real grain. The same world it had always been, and her in it different. Judge Harmon arrived at 9 in the morning. He was a compact, gray-haired man who listened without interruption for 40 minutes and asked 7 questions, each one precise and without excess. He read the ledger. He read Pruitt's letter. He examined the original deed and the fraudulent transfer document side by side for a long time, the way a man examined things when he was making sure his eyes agreed with his understanding. Then he looked at Evelyn and said, "This is complete." "Yes," she said. "The fraudulent transfer is void. The original deed stands. Your property is yours." He set the documents down. "I'll have the formal declaration drawn up within the hour. Ellison will be removed from the land office, pending a full investigation. Pruitt." He glanced toward the inner office where Pruitt had been sitting since 8 in the morning. "Pruitt will face consequences proportionate to his involvement. The letter helps him somewhat. It does not help him entirely." "I understand," Evelyn said. "Mrs. Carter." He looked at her directly. "How long were you in those hills?" 18 days. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not quite admiration, something quieter than that. Something that looked more like the recognition of one serious person by another. "The declaration will be ready within the hour," he said again, and went back to his work. Ruth drove her home. Not the horse. Ruth had a mule and a flat cart that she used for hauling, and she drove it with the competence of someone who had been driving the same mule on the same roads for 20 years and had no interest in drama. They went in silence for most of the way. The kind of silence that wasn't empty. When the farm came into sight, Ruth stopped the cart at the top of the rise, and they both looked at it. The house was intact. Of course it was. Gerald had wanted it, not wanted to destroy it. The barn was closed, but the weather vane on the roof was spinning east, which meant the wind had shifted, which meant a clearing. The fence along the east field was half buried in drift but standing. The smoke was gone from the chimney. It looked like a house that had been empty for 18 days and was waiting. "Go on," Ruth said. Evelyn climbed down from the cart. Her boots hit the snow, and she stood for a moment looking at the house she had walked out of in the early dark, with a hunting pack and an axe and nothing else. She walked up the path. The door was unlocked. Gerald's doing. Probably he'd wanted access, or he'd simply not seen the point of locking a door to a house he considered his. She pushed it open. The kitchen first. The table was the same. The chairs were the same, all of them, including the one she hadn't been able to look at directly since the kitchen floor, which was still there, pushed slightly aside from its usual place, as if someone had moved it and not put it back exactly right. She walked to it and straightened it. She stood with her hand on the back of it for a moment. Solid wood, real grain. His chair. "I kept the house," she said. Her voice in the empty kitchen was very small. She didn't try to make it bigger. She went through every room, not quickly, deliberately, with the same methodical attention she'd given the cave, reading the space the way she'd learned to read everything in the past 18 days. What was there? What had been moved? What needed repair? The bedroom undisturbed, which meant Gerald hadn't gotten that far, or hadn't wanted to, which she found she was grateful for without analyzing it closely. The parlor, a chair shifted, a book moved, the evidence of someone who had briefly occupied a space they didn't understand. The back room where Thomas kept his tools untouched. All of it. She went back to the kitchen and built a fire in the stove. It caught on the second try, which was slower than she'd gotten used to in the cave, and faster than she probably deserved given the state of her hands. She filled the kettle from the indoor pump, the luxury of it striking her in a way it never had before. Water from a pump instead of a spring dug out from under snow, and set it on the stove and listened to the stove tick as it heated. She sat down at the table. She sat in Thomas's chair. She hadn't done that before. She wasn't sure why she did it now. Some instinct, something that the cave had burned clear of sentiment and left something truer underneath. She sat in his chair and felt the particular shape of it, the way the back had worn to accommodate him, the way the seat was lower on the right side from years of his habit of resting his weight there. She pressed her palms against the table, the same way she'd pressed them against the cave floor and the sheriff's desk and the back of his chair. All the same world, all still here. The kettle began to whisper. She thought about what she had done and what it had cost. She had lost 18 days and gained something she had no clean name for, yet the knowledge of what she was made of, which was a thing most people never learned, because most people were never required to. It was not a comfortable knowledge. It was not the kind of thing you carried easily. But it was hers, the way the deed was hers, the way the house was hers, the way Thomas's chair was hers to sit in now and hers to stand up from when she was ready. She was not the woman who had walked out the back door. That woman had been capable of survival but hadn't known it. Capable of fighting but hadn't believed it. Capable of standing in front of a corrupt man in a lit office and dismantling everything he'd built. But she'd needed 18 days in the dark to discover that about herself, and a blizzard to confirm it, and a half-second of her husband's voice in a smoke-filled cave to prove that the things we carry from the people we love don't leave us when they do. She was not the woman who had walked out the back door. She was the woman who had come in the front. The kettle sang. She stood up, poured the water, and made the tea. She stood at the kitchen window with the cup in her hands and looked out at the white fields, the bare trees, the long reach of winter across everything she owned, and she felt the weight of all of it. The grief still there, always there, the kind that didn't resolve but only changed shape, and she didn't push it down, and she didn't let it take her over. She held it the way you held something that belonged to you. Outside, the weather vane spun east. The wind had shifted. Spring was a long way off, but it was coming. It came every year. It came after everything. Some things the cold could not keep. She drank her tea and watched the light move across the snow and knew, with the particular certainty of a woman who had walked through fire and ice and the worst that human cruelty and natural disaster could arrange between them, that she would be here when it arrived. She had survived the storm. But more than that, she had learned what the storm had always known about her, that she was not someone who could be erased. Not by grief, not by greed, not by the deliberate cruelty of men who confused a woman's silence with surrender. Evelyn Carter had been driven from her home. She had built a new one from stone and darkness and her own two hands. And she had carried it back with her when she returned, not as a memory, not as a story, but as the permanent, unassailable truth of who she was. The door was open. The fire was burning. She was home.